Okay, so I got to meet you a little bit earlier when you were on KUOW today, and I pulled you aside and told you how much I loved your book. It is, I have a child. Usually when I read, I fall asleep after about 2 sentences, and I don't finish books that often, and this was not the case with your book.
That's good to know. Yeah. Not a snoozer.
Yes. But one of the things I loved about it was that Penelope doesn't show up for, I think, the first 100 pages.
I know. People were shocked about that.
Well, initially when I was reading this, I was like, okay.
Who is this about?
But what I loved is the way you talked about, you situated your own upbringing in terms of gender and race. And so when we do meet Penelope, we have a full understanding of who you are when you come to that, which I really, really loved. So I feel like this is such an essay question, but what did you learn about gender and who you were supposed to be growing up?
Read the book.
So there's 100 pages about this in this book.
I didn't introduce Penelope until about after page 100, and that was somewhat intentional. I really didn't want to tell Penelope's story. I wanted to tell my story. And there was also this, at first I thought, oh, Penelope's here, Penelope comes, and the problem starts with Penelope. Mm-hmm. Right? That's how I was feeling at one point in my life. I didn't understand my own child. And when I started to think back through our lineage and take the story before Penelope and put Penelope in the context of the family and of the history, it was much more helpful for me. So the book is a telling of our family from the turn of the century in the South, down South, and it comes all the way up to present-day Brooklyn. It takes a little voyage into our Ghanaian history and our Ghanaian culture. But I think, so when I talk about what I've learned as a woman and what I've learned around gender and race, I'm talking about it through the lens of my family. And my mother's from the South, my father's from Harlem. Most of the women in my family are revolutionaries. Most of the wealth and the education that was amassed and the accomplishments, many of the accomplishments were amassed by the women. So they're not weak women. They're not women that are tucked away. These are, they were leaders in their churches, they were leaders in the front line of marching, and as well with the men. We had some very strong men in our family. Gil Scott Heron, who wrote The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, is my uncle. And so I grew up with a very progressive, a very rebellious, a very radical way of thinking. My grandmother married 5 times. One man she married twice. She fought school boards and hospitals during the segregated South and won. She had a PhD and a master's during a time when America wasn't even sure she should be in school. My mother studied at Wesleyan, University of Strasbourg, Harvard, and she studied French. Right? And my Aunt Lerma decided on child without husband. She and Gil had a relationship for years, and they have a child together. So women and atypical behavior and revolutionary thinking is a part of my system. So I did have that from my family. But when I also look at it, I also understood gender from more in a different way. So I'm going to fast forward, but when I graduated from Spelman College, historically black college in Atlanta, all women. And I didn't know what I wanted to do for a year, and I finally understood what I wanted to do, and I came back to tell my dad, I want to study literature. I want to go to grad school. And before I could even get out, can you help me pay? Can you pay for it? He said, not a chance. Do what you want, but I'm not going to pay for it. And I said, well, why? You went to law school, and you studied, and you've understood how important education is and following interest. And he said, well, grad school is for gay and fat and ugly women. Right? And he just let those words sit there, determining what those words meant for me. And I remember thinking, well, that split second, here's a man who has determined what gay, fat, and ugly means. What if I have definitions that are different? He clearly was using it as a negative. Perhaps I see it differently. And also I was noticing how he was saying what I could have and what he could have. And I realized he went to grad school, right? So men can go to grad school, but women, ultimately, he said, you're beautiful. Your skin's so beautiful. And I remember the words, you can marry well. And so he also taught me to be very rebellious. He taught me to be outspoken, but there were caps to that as a woman. So I have a lot of mixed memories around gender. He also, the same, and I love my father. I've learned, and we've developed this, he's passed at this point, but we developed a relationship together. One of the strongest figures in my life. When we were young and my sisters and I didn't want to wear our Sunday dresses. We wanted to wear jeans underneath our dresses, and my mom would say, just put a dress on, we're going to church, can you please get it together? And my dad would say, no, who cares what they look like? They're happy. Let them wear what they want. They're happy children. If we didn't want to brush our hair, my dad would say, I got it, Afro contest by Easter. Who has the biggest, baddest Afro by Easter? So his whole thing was like, you're not here to be pretty. Ironically, he's the one telling me I should marry well. But you're here to reimagine, and you were here to challenge the status quo, but don't challenge it further than I want you to challenge. So that was my understanding of gender. It is convoluted and unclear.
Yeah. How did that inform who you thought you were supposed to be? I mean, that's a lot.
I think that when I always knew that we were raised in an actively black family. So our family decided, as many black families did at that time, that blackness was really important and it was integral to our success. So if you found roots in your culture and in your community and you held tight to the black culture, you would be better off. So our schools and our hospitals and our communities and our churches were rooted in the goodness of black families. And so for me, our black culture was where I saw my community. And when I, fast forward into my adult life, and I have my own children, child one, that theory was still working. Child two, that theory was still working. When Penelope came, I needed my community to be much wider than that. And so that's when I just started thinking, not only does gender have to be looked at, also race, class, regionalism, all of that. Just started peeling it apart. So what was the question?
I asked you how all of that informed, who you thought you needed to be.
Still not sure who I need to be.
Right.
Definitely know what doesn't work anymore for me. So, the background of my story is that, or the turning point, the impetus to writing this book is, so I'm on my second marriage, and I have my first child from my first marriage is Georgia. My second child from my next marriage is Cassius. And then the third child, also from the second father, is Penelope. And we named Penelope after grandmother, and we also named Penelope after the African day of the week. Penelope was born on Ajua, very Ghanaian name. And everything, doctor says girl, we think girl, everything is fantastic. But within the first year, Penelope begins to show signs of distress. So long list of examples, changing diaper. Anything that related to the body was rejected. So changing a diaper was very difficult. Getting dressed was very difficult. Brushing teeth was difficult. And I'm a mother of 5, so like temper tantrums don't bother me. I can zone that out. But this was heavier, so I had to literally call backup. Dad, come help me change Penelope. And we'd have to hold Penelope down to change a diaper. Felt really weird. Now in hindsight, I know that the toothbrush Penelope was smacking was pink and it had a princess on it. And the toothbrush that Penelope was grabbing was Brothers and it had a superhero on it. Diapers have butterflies on girls and Spider-Man on boys. Clothing is different. Stitching, I found this out. Even on blue jeans for girls, there's pink stitching, right? And Penelope would spot the pink stitching, and we would have to, I remember one night we blacked out the pink stitching with a permanent marker. Went through every single clothing and marked over the pink stitching because it was so problematic. We couldn't get out the door. So by the end of the second year of Penelope's life, constant reoccurring nightmares, nail biting until bloody, screaming, crying, pushing siblings, pushing kids at the park. Most interaction was protest. No, no, no. And so I tried to fix it. So I was like, okay, maybe longer naps, maybe more hugs. Maybe I forgot, maybe I was too busy. I remember changing. I thought maybe it's a dairy allergy. Maybe I'll just take out dairy and Penelope will act better, you know? Like, what are the circumstantial things that I can change as a mother? Because that's where my brain was focused on. What can I do to change the situation? Nothing helped enough. Cutting hair slightly made Penel smile, or jeans helped a little bit. But one day we had just reached our maximum and Penelope was horrendous, and I decided to pick Penelope up for a timeout and take us both into another room.
I remember this scene in the book.
Yeah.
You basically lay on the ground with Penelope as he's crying, and he tells you he was 3, right?
Had not turned 3 yet,
He
like
had
a
not
month away
turned 3.
from 3.
Yeah.
And I said, baby, why are you so angry? It was the first time I had asked him, why are you so angry? And Penelope was like the $1 million question, just opened up and said, well, because everyone thinks I'm a girl mama, and I'm not. So again, I was thinking in my own head, oh, Penelope is a feminist. She realizes that there's sexism in this world, and she's choosing tough girl over weak boy. She's choosing tough boy over weak girl. So I thought, feminist. And then I said, well, it's fine. However you feel is fine. If you feel like a boy, it's fine. And Penelope said, no, Mama, I don't feel like a boy. I am a boy. At 3. So that was the lesson between feeling and being for me. Did not understand it quite yet. It took me another year. But eventually, what I came up with after searching and researching and listening to new language and finding organizations and listening to doctors and going down the rabbit hole of the internet, the only thing that made sense to me was that Penelope is transgender. Penelope is not a rebellious girl, not a grumpy girl or a girl in reaction to anything. Penelope's a boy.
But while you were doing all that year where you were looking for that answer, between that moment when Penelope says, I don't feel like a boy, I am a boy, which I imagine you still remember with perfect clarity that moment, and then the year following where you try to find the answer, what was your relationship like with Penelope? I mean, what were, how are you, what was happening with Penelope? Did he still have to wear jeans with pink stitching? What was happening?
Well, we were kind of beyond the clothing. I mean, in our house, girls and boys can do many of the same things. So Penelope wasn't forced to wear dresses after a certain point. Short hair, no problem. But it was more in the smaller ways that I noticed the difference that I was, the different way in which I was raising my children. Intellectually, we know we shouldn't raise our children with bias, but we do. So I'm talking like this to the girls. Yeah, you get them. Go be sassy. Do it. Pushing them to go with a voice like this in everything. I was talking to my girls. And then my sons, I was like, let me tell you, I need you to come here. I was talking to them with some definition. I think I was talking to my husband like that too. We're no longer together. But I found myself speaking in different tones, girl tone, boy tone. I found myself wanting to protect my daughters from rape culture and from bad people and from mean things. Mm-hmm. And I found myself allowing my sons to be a lot more dirty and messy and fall down and come up swinging type personality. Yeah. And so, although at first I experienced a lot of guilt. I thought I failed this girl.
Why did you think that?
Because it wasn't. I did not understand gender variance. I didn't understand the non-binary. I thought we were just either male or female. So a lot of it was lack of education. A lot of what we're dealing with is just misinformation. So I'm thinking, here's a girl who does not want to be a girl, and I feel so sorry for you because who would want to be a man, right? In my mind at that point. Trans men not included. Who would want to be a white cisgender man? So I thought that I had failed to raise a proud girl who wanted to be a woman. I thought that I had dropped the ball on feminism. So it took me a while to not stay in that guilt. But I kept the story, I kept Penelope's reveal for about a year so I could understand it more. So I did the research on my own. You know, Malcolm Gladwell says 10,000 hours to be an expert. I was like, I will do the 10,000 hours before I do anything else. Yeah. So put the time in, understand, find new language, go to grad school, basically. And that made my world very small. It was me and Penelope. And I have 5 children. So I was not as... So I downplayed it. I said, look, you take the other 4, I'll take Penel. And that's what parents do when they have multiple children. It was like no big deal. But really it made a divide between me and Penelope and between the rest of the world. And I was judging who's on the side with us, because it felt like everyone was on the other side. It was difficult. It was a difficult time to really figure out how to incorporate all of us in this transition.
Well, once you completed grad school, once you completed your 10,000 hours, and and it might be false to sort of describe this as like you didn't know and then you did know, but once you had more clarity around what was happening with Penel, how did you bridge that gap that had formed between you and Penel and everybody else? Yeah.
I think so my first step was let me get more informed. And I spent, a lot of time researching. My next step was, because when you know something new, you want to tell everyone. You can't go back to not knowing. And I'm like, I wanted to tell everyone, it's all rigged. This whole gender thing is rigged. We don't even know the half of it. Guess what I've just learned, right? And so you have the dinner table, and they're like, would you like another glass of rosé? And I'm like, transgender. Would you like another glass of rosé? Intersex. Gender nonconforming. And so I think it was annoying to people, to say the least. And one of my kids, who it took many years to get back together, he said, all you know is transgender, mama. Because my attention, first of all, we are finite, not infinite. I had finite amounts of energy. At the end of the day, I was exhausted, I was tired, I was scared. Because you have to, the images that I had were Paris is burning. So when Penelope said I'm a boy, I thought, in those seconds, I flashed to Paris is burning, where most of the teens were killed, died. I flashed to Silence of the Lamb, Silence of the Lamb, where the psychopath is wiggling in front of the mirror. And I thought, is this what we're talking about? Because that's what I knew of this big question mark around gender nonconforming. I didn't have any language, but those are the pictures that I saw. Yeah. And so my only mission was, at that point, save Penelope, which I thought was literally about isolated to protecting my child. And a lot of it was. Penelope stabilized, and Penelope has just risen up. But it became more than that. It's really like what I saw myself in Penelope. So I ended up wanting what I was giving Penelope. I wanted the freedoms. I wanted the flexibility. I wanted the fluidity. I wanted the ability to just change from what they thought to what I am. So I think as I was working with Penelope, I was really working on myself. Yeah, I was working on being, and this is the interesting thing. So I was able to get family members to come along slowly to understand Penelope. And sometimes I would get them to come through a straight conversation around gender and transgender, and sometimes I would get them in a back door through language. So,
can you give an example?
Yeah, here's a good one. So, Dad is from Ghana, and his father is from Ghana. Penelope's grandfather is very traditional Ghanaian, older man. He's an eye surgeon, very well traveled, very well educated, but chooses to hold on to his Ghanaian culture. And so he was coming to stay with us, and we knew he was quite traditional in his understanding of life. And he oftentimes said to me, shh, 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 don't speak. Don't speak after a man. Only men finish important conversations. So I knew that he had some very particular opinions. And I thought he's never going to understand Penelope, nor will he accept Penelope. So we decided we won't use the word transgender, we won't talk about the body, we'll just ask him to change his language. So we said very politely, we sat him down, we fed him a stew, that's what he likes, and we said, Grandpa G, would it be okay if you please just use he and him, if you just change the pronouns? And he said, sure, absolutely, because in my language of Twi, we don't use gender pronouns. So they don't matter to me, I can't remember them, they mean nothing. So language for him was flexible.
Yeah.
He spent the next several years of his life interacting with his grandson, not thinking much about trans or cis, didn't even know those terms, I don't think, but they had a great relationship. So that was interesting to me, that there were different ways to come into it.
Yeah.
And all of us eventually found ways to share life with Penelope. When I decided to express my transition, my change, my new way of being, it was much harder for people to accept.
Do you mean aside from annoying people at dinner parties?
On a deeper level. Meaning,
yeah, what did that look like?
So when Penelope raised his hand to say, I'm a boy, and when we accepted, everyone had a sense of trust that they could also say who they were underneath. So every single one of my kids said, well, I have something to tell you as well, since you're listening. One said I'm genderqueer. One said I'm a scientist. You know, I need you to like wear the shirt that says I love scientists. I need you to be pro-science. And I felt, you know, I run through the streets in a T-shirt that says, you know, protect trans kids. He's like, what about the science kid? Like, who's protecting us? And and they think about it this way. They think about it just as your particulars. Like children see themselves as a part of the same human experience with different particulars. So everyone had a new way of revealing themselves, a more authentic way, but as an adult, when you start telling people that you've had relationships with for 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, I'm different, I'm new, that woman is not here anymore, this is the woman that's here. My husband said, I want that woman. I want her, that one. And I said, well, she was cute, but she's not here. She's not here. She's not coming back, not in that way. So there's, of course, essentially I'm the same person, but I'm going to show you a different. This woman is here. And we could not make that. Because you have 20 years of holding on to someone's identity. It means so much to you. Yeah. I had 2.5 with Penelope. I could let go of some of those. I could let them all go. All of those stories that I want, of beautiful, smart, rebellious woman. I had her hair, her clothing. Come to find out, we're not even talking about her, right? So I had to get rid of all those stories. But it was only 2 years. With me, people had invested 20, 30, 40 years in my story, and they found it hard to let go of that. Hard to let go.
I have a lot more questions I want to ask you, but I'm going to bring up our other guest.
Yes.
So, and I'm going to look at my notes because there's a lot I want to say about the next person who's coming up. Spencer Bergstedt has been a lawyer, an advocate for the LGBTQ community. He's also a trainer. He's an author, and he's a parent as well. And in the back, we were talking about parenting. We'll get more into parenting a little bit. But one of the things that Spencer can do, you made this joke in the back that when you go do trainings on gender diversity, you try and diffuse the situation quickly where people are clearly asking, why is there a white dude on stage talking about diversity right now?
Not just white, but white and middle-aged.
What do you know?
Exactly. What do I know? Why am I here to talk to you about any of this stuff?
But you had you transitioned, you bring your experience as a trans man wherever you go. And so you transitioned 25 years ago.
I did.
And how did people respond to letting go of who they thought you were versus who you were becoming?
I think it really depends on who you talk to.
Yeah.
Right? So my parents were actually pretty darn good about it. I'm an only child, so they didn't have a lot of choice about whether they were going to get on board or not. So I had come out to my parents as being, for lack of a better term, lesbian when I was probably 15 or 16. That did not go over well in the 1970s in Minnesota. My dad was actually pretty cool about it, but my mom definitely had this reaction of, well, nobody can know. And I'm like, have you looked at me? I was a very masculine presenting person from day one. This is not a new iteration of who I am. You look at pictures of me as a baby, and you're like, that's a boy. So I spent, a number of years living as an out queer person, and eventually came to this place of transition. And a big piece of that for me was, you got to remember, I transitioned in 1995. So essentially right at about the time that AOL had become popular. For those of you who are young, you have no idea what I'm talking about. For those of you who are a little bit older, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
You are getting applause from one person right now about AOL.
Yeah. So there wasn't a lot of community to find, right? So you found a person who then maybe knew another person, and then you made connections. And I used to joke when I first came out as trans that all of the trans men knew each other, because we literally did all know each other from everywhere in the country. There were only a handful of us that were out. It was a very different time.
Because we're also saying if only a few are out, there are millions of trans
There are millions,
people.
absolutely.
So that means millions are in hiding.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and for good reasons.
Absolutely.
You know,
But it's sad.
it is sad. So the world was very different when I came out. The community did not deal so well. So my parents were pretty cool. My mom actually was like, well, I'm not surprised. And then basically said, your whole childhood makes a lot more sense to me now. My extended family members all live in Sweden. We immigrated to the States when I was 2, so all my family's still back there. And a cousin had come to visit, and she's like, yeah, we've all kind of guessed that for a while. It's like, oh, okay, great.
Do they have a reference point for trans?
And yeah, I think Sweden actually has been a little bit ahead of the curve on some of this stuff, so at least my family members there were great. The community here in Seattle, not so great. The women's community in particular was very hostile. I had betrayed the sisterhood. I was a bad feminist. I had taken the easy way out by transitioning and not continuing to live as a butch dyke.
As if that's easy.
As if that's super simple, right? It was a really mixed bag for me.
Yeah.
The men's community here, however, the gay men's community, was far more welcoming to me at that time, which I find interesting. And I had talked to Kristen the other day about sort of the interesting things that happen within gay men's community around trans issues, sort of the exaltation of drag queens, but the denigration of trans women, and refusing to see trans men as men, which all roots itself in misogyny, right? So there's just a lot of interesting complexities around trans issues, and we're still figuring it out.
Yeah.
And also, as soon as you start to, I'm sorry, this might be
No,
off
go
format.
ahead, please.
But as I'm listening to you, and this is a lot of what I worked through in my book, is like when you start to unpeel gender, and you naturally then start to unpeel race and regionality, right? Southern versus northern, and poverty versus wealth.
Urban versus rural.
Urban versus rural. And I did this experiment while I was writing my book. I started rereading James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, which is a book set in the 60s, I believe, and he's writing about his experience as a black man in a very heated America. And I took, every time he wrote the word Negro, I put the word trans, overlapped it, not to compare trans people and black people, but to compare oppression. It smells the same. And so I remember saying, if we don't course correct, we know the outcome. We've seen it in race. Bloody, horrible, divisive. If we don't course correct, that same outcome will happen. Every time we split, every time we other, Every time we say over there is someone different and maybe dangerous, and maybe I'll help them over there because they need help. As soon as we start to create that other space, and there really is no other. The more I look at Penelope, because that's the good thing about being a mom, right?
Yeah.
You can, and when people say you can't live through your children, that's bullshit. You do. That's all you do. You live through your kids. And I cannot separate myself from trans to the point where my teenage daughter said, you have to stop co-opting the trans experience. It's like, shut up.
It's hard, though, as a parent not to, right? So for me, my daughter's 14, and my child's difference is that she has autism. And so one of the things that struck me in reading your book, and I talked to my partner about this the other day, I sort of instinctively knew that you and I would be able to connect on the issue of you have a child and you as a parent map out this whole life for them like the minute they're born. And I think all parents experience some sense of loss and that their kids are not going to follow the path that you thought they were going to follow. But I think when you have a child who has some sort of difference, whether that's neurotypicality, whether that's gender, whether that's any other kind of disability, whatever that might be, you have a sense of grief and loss that your child is not going to live this life that you thought that they were going to have. And so adjusting to that as a new normal is sometimes a rough ride.
I have to say, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's this really interesting pattern developing between what the two of you have talked about, which is this idea of having to let go of who you thought someone was, whether they are your theoretical child before they're your actual child, or it's a person that you've known who is now changing, which happens, in lots of different ways. I mean, so how do you understand what that looks like now in your relationships with other human beings? I don't know if we ever get good at this stuff, honestly.
I don't think so either. I think we only change when the current system refuses to work for us any longer. So if I had never had Penelope, I would not know. Trans people would be invisible to me. I never saw trans people before Penelope. I never heard trans stories. Clearly, they were there. I just was blind to them. So Penelope smacked me in the face and forced me to change my understanding. But if the current story everything is a story, religion is a story, and race is a story. If the current story works, you keep going, and then when it doesn't work, you're forced to course correct. I mean, it is so obvious to me. Here's another example. So Georgia, my first child, her father is Swiss, and so one day when she was young, she said, "Mama, why am I white and you're black?" I said, "No. We're both black. Let's be very clear here." And she said, "Well, why is your skin so dark and mine so light?" I said, "Oh, because I'm chocolate black, you're golden black." And she said, "Oh." I said, "But actually, the whole world is black. Everyone's black." And I did that because I wanted her to feel central. So I said, she goes, "Everyone?" I said, "Everyone. Everyone is black." She goes, "Well, what about Papa?" I said, "Yeah, he's a light-skinned black guy." Right? Because I wanted her, and I think it's really important, and I stand by the lie, because it's important for us to centralize our identities. It was a clumsy way of centralizing her, but in some moment in your life, you have to centralize your identity. Find people that reflect you. Find the story that surrounds you, that puts you in the center of it. So I went to Spelman College for that. I told Georgia that her father was black because of that. Years later, she said, "Mommy, he's European." But find us, because I don't know how to do it if you're always on the other side, if you're always feeling marginalized, if you're always feeling, you will never have that understanding of humanity. You have to be centralized. So the only way I do it is to centralize my identities, plural. So that means I don't have one identity. I don't find just black people communities. I find LGBT community as well. I guess I'm two identities, black and LGBT. But the point is, find where your community is and then centralize yourself. And I think that helps us to shift.
Yeah.
I will say that one thing that I'm sort of looking forward to seeing what happens with kids like Penelope is because they're able to come out at an earlier age and be supported by their families in ways that didn't exist for me as a young person. Because there's so much access to information via the internet, because we are, in some ways, the world is a much smaller place than it used to be, right? So I wonder for those kids how their lives will look different than mine. In that, will they need to find other community amongst other trans people? So as an example, I have a friend who has a son who is 14, trans boy, and they just moved here last year from San Diego. And she'd asked her son if he wanted to join the GSA at school, and he's like, nah, I don't need that. And to me, I was like, well, on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, that's awesome that you don't feel like you need that you don't need to be set apart in some way. And on the other hand, I wonder, as he grows older, will there be some sense of disconnect or loss for him at not having a community that understands this particular difference, right? Because there's a language that we as trans people can use with each other that when we talk about our experiences and our histories and our fears, right? Because we still all have fears. We have fears of not getting a job or getting fired from a job, or will I find love? Will anybody find me attractive? Will I be able to have the life that I want to have? Am I going to suffer housing discrimination? All of those things. Will I get into school if I have to disclose this piece of information?
And I travel.
Yeah, and travel right now is a big one, you know. And I'm sitting here as an immigrant wondering if my passport's going to get renewed or not.
But I think we have to push for that. So I think, so my daughter said, I'm not going to Spelman College, not a chance. It's too conservative. It's not diverse enough, sexually, gender-wise, politically. So she said no to Spelman. But she also said she's not impressed with like organizations like the Human Rights Campaign. So I sit on the board of HRC, and she said they're not woke enough. They don't have the dialogue around, you know, Black trans lives and queer kids of color. They don't even know. They're not woke. So I think, you know, we do have a tendency to say no to the groups that don't really. But I think it's our duty to force our children to, I know it's ironic. I think it is essential that we spend some time in communities that absolutely reflect us. It may not be sustainable for life. It may not be, you know, what is realistic, but it's important. I think we have to insist. So whatever that part of you, that part of your culture that might not be reflected in the larger world, I think we have to find those places and really spend some time there. So we do transgender family sleepaway camp twice a year, and all the kids go. And I think that will do something for them. And I don't know if they would choose it themselves. I found it. I paid the bills, and so we go.
I do wonder, though. I mean, you talked about forcing your kids to do some of this.
It's a bad choice of words.
I wonder
Strongly
how your kids have,
encouraged.
shall we say, compelled. How have your children compelled each of you to think differently about how you relate with other people in the world?
So one of the things for me that's interesting is because my daughter is pretty profoundly impacted by her autism, sometimes going out in public is super challenging because she doesn't always know how to be appropriate or sometimes draws attention, or when she was much younger, she would have really severe temper tantrums. Which then draws all eyes to you as a parent, and you feel the eyes of judgment of, oh my God, you're a bad parent. Or, worse, pity. I'd take you're a bad parent over I pity you any day. So the things that my daughter has taught me are patience, like in the extreme. You have to be patient. And I am not by nature a patient person. I want what I want, and I want it now. And because I have been around kids with varying amounts of disability now, I also look at the world in a really different way around access and ableism in a way that I probably never would have, if it weren't for her. And so, again, when we talk about intersectionality of a number of things, like that is part of my intersectionality in the world, is that I have to look at things in terms of what is she able to access, what does she get denied?
Listening to both of you talk about your kids, I have reflected often on how easy it can be to dismiss what your kids are saying because they're young, because they're having a tantrum, because of just a litany of reasons. And I'm wondering how your kids have changed or evolved the way you think about that idea of listening to what someone is saying to you versus making the choice to dismiss what they're saying.
That is big in our house. So it was so we 5 children, and we don't agree. So even though I support my Penelope and I have an understanding of trans, it wasn't that everyone came on board with me. So I have one child who's a science geek, and he doesn't scientifically think that trans is proven. Heavy, right? So we have this thing, I have this subversive way of teaching my kids. We have something called the lab. If we disagree, we come together, we sit on the floor, and we have talks around our ideas. And the rules are you can't interrupt. You can talk as long as you want, you can't interrupt the other person. So we'll sit down, and it could be like who gets the front seat, it could be around gender, it could be on race, anything that's a hot topic, we come and we lab it out. So Cassius says, look, Penelope, you're my brother, I respect you, I'll always use the right pronouns, but scientifically speaking, let's be real, you're a girl. Like physiologically, that's a girl's body, we have to talk in the language of science. And so I'm holding my tongue because I know that that's bogus science. I mean, there is science to prove gender variance, but he's 13, right? And the rules are I can't interrupt. Penelope is also holding back and waiting his turn. And when it's his turn, he says, well, dude, it's not always about science, right? I exist. There's the proof. It's not an opinion. And really, the only thing you have to know, Cassius, is that this is how God has made me. This is how God has made me. And Cassius waits his turn, and he says, God's not proven either. That's just ridiculous. Like, you got to give me proof here. So you're talking about God, you're talking about transgender. All of that is just a theory, and I'm not buying it. This is 8 years. Cassius is on the far end. Penelope's on the lived experience, and they've not gotten any closer. So what it taught me is that agreeing is not the goal. Right. We don't have to agree. Discuss, debate with respect. Because then they'll do 20 minutes of Penelope, 20 minutes of Cassius, 25 minutes of Othello. After 60 minutes, they're like, let's just go play basketball. Dude, are you ready to eat some dinner? Yeah. You know, so we are a family that actually resembles what's happening in politics. I have a son who represents that really scary politician. Yeah. And I've learned to not be too rattled by it. We just talk it out. Yeah.
Which brings to mind to me, and I want to go back to something that you had asked earlier, that notion that unless you're confronted with it or it becomes part of your life, you don't know, right? So I think back to, probably almost 30 years ago now when we had Initiative 35 in Seattle, which was about Initiative 35. It was an attempt to overturn anti-discrimination laws in Seattle by a right-wing group led by Lon Mabon, who had also tried to do similar things in Oregon. And at the time, Hands Off Washington was the main sort of political organizing group within the LGBT community. And one of the things that we did, and did very successfully, was doorbelling. Because you can't vote against us if you've met us, right? So if I come to your door and I introduce myself and you claim, oh, I've never met a gay or lesbian person, well, now you have. And let me talk to you about who I am. It's harder to discriminate against somebody that you know in person than it is to discriminate against an idea of who someone is based in an abstract or in rhetoric that gets thrown out about who that group of people might be.
Theoretical person versus actual person. I have a lot more questions for the two of you, but I know the audience has questions as well. So we're going to wrap up this portion of it. Thank you both so much. I have so enjoyed talking with you.
Hello. Thank you. We're going to open up to Q&A, and we have a special guest here that's gonna start us off. If you have a question, please try to remember to keep your question in question format, and we'll try to get to as many folks as possible. We have a hard stop today at 8 because Jodie is actually heading back to New York and has a flight to catch. Our first question asker is here. It's Eve Pillay, and I just want to say she's here with her daughter, and she's come here from Bainbridge, and I just think tonight is such a cool example of families supporting each other. Eve is on the board of both Bainbridge Pride and Kitsap Pride, and she wanted me to remind you that Bainbridge Pride Family Festival is Sunday, June 23rd. So welcome, Eve, to kick us off.
Thank you very much. And thank all of you up there. I very much appreciate it. I very much like that we started out with Jodie's talking about this is really a book about her. And I think it's really important that we really recognize the parents of trans kids and what they go through and the changes they have to make. One of the things that I learned during my transition, one of the things I learned really early on, is that we are all in transition. Mine just happens to seem obvious, but that's not really the case. It's what's going on inside of me. And Stuart, I think that I met you at an Out in Front meeting a year and a half ago. And one of the things that I had learned at that Out in Front leadership program, the LGBT Seattle Leadership Program, was that how easy it is to put everything in defensive terms. You know, it's really easy to say, this is the issues that trans people have. You know, we have a higher suicide rate, we have a higher homeless rate, we have a higher this rate, we have a higher problem with medical services, and all that, and every one of those things is really supportive. But not one of them says, this is what's good about being trans. This is what's good about being the parent of somebody who's trans. I took this to my trans group. I said, it seemed everything they talked about was negative. What could you tell me here that we can put down this positive on this whiteboard? And they said, well, we have a higher suicide rate than anybody. We have a higher difficulty of this and that. I said, no. I want to know about the joy. Yeah. I want to know about what's right with being trans. I want to know why, and I'm waiting for this answer. For me, it's like, first thing I said, I've got to get in touch with the faith community. What do I do with the faith community? I'm just present. That's what I do. And the one thing, by the way, Jodie, that I miss from the 1960s civil rights movement and moved into general use was keep the faith, baby. Yeah. Now, nobody says keep the faith anymore. I miss that. But I want to know in your transitions and what your dealings, what is positive?
So much. That's a great one. You want to go first? Well, so I learned, fluidity to me versus rigidity. And mental flexibility is what I've taken from Penelope, what I've tried to model myself. And I read a lot about physical flexibility being tied to mental flexibility. And I also look at that as fluidity. So Penelope is generous, can understand, can read between the lines. And a lot of his friends who are gender nonconforming, we build up this muscle. If you're privileged, you get a little fat and lazy, right? But if you are not privileged, quote unquote, not privileged, you can navigate in different ways. So I noticed that Penelope is, he reads the subtext, he understands people, he can see through the surface. That to me This is a good question because it's very easy to check off what the hard things, the shitty things are. And then I feel really awkward talking about, well, all trans people are fantastic. But I believe that it's kind of the pros that I see in my son. He is fluid in his thinking, in his way of adapting to situations. He's also tenacious. It took him years to get his point across to me, for me to understand what he was talking about. I stumbled over it so many times. He kept saying it, I am a boy. Before language, with language, tenacity. I think it's like when you have an insight into multiple realities, because the one I was living in was one reality. Turn the corner, there's another reality. Penelope has seen it. He saw me in that other world. He experiences that every day, and he knows his world very well. I think this sight, many of us are blind. I think Penelope and perhaps many trans people are not blind. They see things. Penelope sees it. My genderqueer daughter sees it. She tells me all the time, don't do that again. It's not, you don't know what you're doing, you don't see what you're doing, but this is what it looks like. So I think tenacity, vision, and flexibility.
I would agree with that. I think for me, there's a resilience that comes from being trans that you're sort of thrust into. Like you have to rise or you will sink. And so over and over and over again, what I see in trans people is their resilience at whatever their circumstances have been, that they continue to rise and to step out the door and do what they have to do. And it doesn't matter where they live. Sometimes it's harder in some places. But that resilience is really important. And I do think that all of us who are trans have a bit of the observer in us. We have to, right? So for those of us who were assigned female at birth and had experiences thrust upon us about how to be ladylike or how to be a female person in this culture, we know what that is. And then when you transition, then you're looking at, and I remember reading in your book, and you're talking about Penelope looking at his brothers like, okay, so that's how I walk, and that's how I do this, and that's how I do that. And that is a process that trans people go through when they transition later in life as well, right? We're constantly observing and trying to figure out, what do I have to do to fit in? The folks that I'm the most excited about are the ones who say, I don't want to fit in. I'm going to make the world fit me, but I don't need to fit into the world. And that, I think, is sort of an exciting place that we're at now.
I think that's a younger group coming up. Like Penelope, I asked Penelope a while ago, well, you're still sort of naive in the process, and I said, do you want to change your name? Right, because we named you Penelope, Ajua, Gloria. Do you want to change your name? And he said, why? And I said, well, for people, it might be more comfortable. Right? It might be more comfortable for people if you had a boy name. So he looks at me and he goes, I was named after my grandmother. I love her. I'm going to keep my name. Right? So he was teaching me some basic things about, like, this is not a gender name, this is a love name. So he keeps his name Penelope. And I think that we might see more of that. So he says, not all boys do this and that.
I have a very good friend who's a professor at CUNY in New York, and he did not change his name when he transitioned, and his first name is Paisley. And I think very much the same way. A lot of us, when Paisley transitioned, who were friends, were like, "So, dude, are you like, what are you doing?" And he's like, "That's my name. Like, that's the name that I've been teaching under. Why would I change that? Like, I teach gender studies. Why would I change my name?" And it's like, oh, well, I hadn't considered that as an option. Not that I would have kept my birth name, but I do think that there's a bigger understanding that the world is going to have to fit us, not us fit the world.
Thank you. Who else has a question? And while I come back to you, I would like to also thank Elliott Bay Books is here. You
I
Karen, raise your
know.
hand.
And they're selling my book, guys.
They
Go
are.
buy it.
So important
They
that
are.
Black stories, LGBT stories, stories of women are captured in books. We're not always in the textbooks. We're not in our esteemed institutions. And because of that, people will rewrite our history all the time and retell our history. To capture a story, an authentic story, as a Black person, as an LGBTQAI person, as a woman, it's really important. So I hope you support the book as well, not just the conversation, but the book. It shows publishers that we're here, and it also sets the record straight.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. My godson is transitioning to be my goddaughter, and his mom and I, her mom and I, are figuring out how to support him through this. And he's just turned 16 and didn't present female throughout his childhood. He's been presenting very masculine. And it's hard for us to know at this moment what's hating himself versus what's loving his true nature. Because he's going through so many other things at this time in his life. And I'd just love to know your experience about how to understand what's the difference and guide and accept through what is a very difficult time in her life at this moment, if that makes sense as a question.
Well, you know, I mean, being a teenager sucks anyway, right? So that's no fun. I hated being a teenager. Hated it. You know, people talk about high school being like the best time of their life. No. So in my mind, there's a couple of things that might help you. So one of the things that I know about many trans women is that they often presented as very masculine prior to transition. You know, I think for a lot of trans folks, as for a lot of lesbian, gay, bisexual folks, you tamp down the thing that is the most real about you because you know that it's not going to be acceptable in some way, right? And so you overcompensate in some other way. So I think the biggest things that you can do for your goddaughter are to say, how can I best support you? Make sure that you use whatever pronouns she wants. Make sure you use whatever name she wants. If she expresses an interest in going and doing something with you that is a girly thing, go do that thing with her. And don't make a big deal about it. Just let it be how life is, right? I think sometimes the thing that happens around transition is that other people focus so much on the transition instead of focusing on the person. So focus on the person, not the transition.
I would agree with that. And to add on to that, so much of the focus is on like the Penelope, right? What are you doing? What do you look like underneath your clothing? What's all these questions. The kid, the trans person becomes public display, which is disgusting, right? It's not fair, and it's not even feasible for that person to take all of that attention. So they end up downplaying or reverting. So what I ended up, and I could see that very easily. 16 is harder to read, but I could see it with Penelope. And what I ended up doing was, instead of asking Penelope to tell me how you feel or to let me know what you want, I just took a lot of the initiative. So I brought in my friend group. Penel's not going to be comfortable with me if he's the only trans person in my entire life. So I made sure my friend group expanded. I didn't know anyone outside of cisgender people. And perhaps cisgender people are the least, the smallest group in my friend group now. So I brought into my friend group. I had folks that come to dinner that pray differently, look differently, identify differently, and my kids see that, and that then gives them a little bit less anxiety. So I wanted to transition first before asking my kid to, transition or be bold. I transitioned, my groups transitioned, the companies that I do business with. My kids hear me all the time talking about the politics of gender, the personal relationships around gender, They hear our older friends talking about their body transitions, the surgeries that they have, things that we would talk about behind closed doors. I just lay it on the table. I talk about it in front of my kids. They can pretend to not listen. They're totally listening, and they're judging if you deserve. Does Mama deserve to know? Can Mama protect me if I let her know? Is it safe to come out? And I'm assuming that the 16-year-old feels some of that too. Why would they tell us anything? It's for us to show that we're worthy of understanding, that we have the capacity to understand them. And so I think we have to demonstrate our changes first, and then we might have stronger, more confident children that can also then share a little bit about their world with us.
We have about 10 minutes left. I think if we're ambitious, we could probably get to 2 more questions. Yes. There's the hand right here.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm a mother of 3 children. 2 of them are transgender. They're identical twins. One came out to us when he was 3, similar age, and the other one at 6 years old, and they're now 8. And their teacher's here with me, and she's amazing. Anyway, so yay for teachers. Sorry. My question is, we live in Seattle, where it's a very liberal city. They're very young. They've never, is this on? Okay. They've never seen the negativity, what you were speaking about being trans. They're very in a bubble. They're very young, and we have shielded them from all of the negativity of being trans. They had a really positive experience coming out. They've had no problems with people accepting them. So my question is, when did you maybe expose Penelope to the not so great reality that people might not always support her? It sounds like your family was pretty supportive, but there were some maybe not so supportive. So maybe that was a little bit more part of your journey that he experienced. But what age did that become more of a reality for Penelope?
So 2 things. Remember, he has a brother named Cassius. Cassius represents the opposition. So Cassius is there to always remind him that we don't always agree on gender. So he hears it in a very safe environment that I've created, but it feels to them like real life. So I've allowed them to have these diverse views at home. So he's never been blind to it. So I did it kind of in relationship to school. So as they started reading or being asked to be aware of news at school, they have to every morning talk about the news. I figured it was a good time to show all the news. So I guess that's around, and my kids are like around 7 years old, they have to do current events every morning. So that's when we talked about, they knew about rape culture, and they knew about poverty, and they know how much America hates poor people and hates black people and hates LGBT people. And they know about the president, and they know about transphobia. I never sit Penelope down and say, the world does not like you. I've never had that. But my parents never sat me down either and said, the world doesn't like you as a black person. They gave us, the first fundamental years were about how fantastic it was from the first question to be black. Going back to that, I mean, I could list all of the great things about being black. And I was also protected from a lot of it because of our class, right, our socioeconomic level. So Penel has a little bit of that privilege too, as do your children. But I think they can look at it from where does this what are the issues of the world? And not only do I protect Penelope, but I stand up for all injustices. So I put all the injustices on the table. I think if you take it away from them, per se, maybe that's too heavy, just from my experience. I put all the injustices of the world on the table, and we talk about it at dinner. We figure out ways that we're going to contribute. I heard Penelope say once that it scares him to understand that trans people are in danger, and black trans people are in particular danger. So I know we take in subliminal messages. He must. I took him in as a black person, as a woman. So yeah, I think the best thing for adults to do is to talk about it. Do you remember when your parents would have dinner parties or conversations and you would
sure.
listen? to adult conversation and ingest it?
And for me, I mean, I grew up during the Vietnam War era, right? So the news was very important in my world. What was happening in terms of the civil rights movement, what was happening in terms of the anti-war movement. I remember watching the Watergate trials or hearings. Yeah. My parents, to their credit, one of the things that I really love about my parents is they never limited anything that I ever read or anything that I ever accessed. I think that's the best thing that you can do for your kids. Let them explore what they want to explore. Don't hide it away. I remember being a kid sitting and watching Walter Cronkite on the evening news and listening to what was happening in the world. If you don't listen to what's happening in the world, how can you engage in the world? Right? If you're just going to live in a bubble, what's the point? So I think that children have a much greater capacity for understanding and processing information than any adult ever gives them credit for. We need to stop treating children like they're stupid, because they're not.
We have time for one more quick question. Any brave soul out there? Yeah.
Hi, this is for Jodie Moore. Going back to, I think it was your genderqueer daughter that said, don't co-opt the trans identity.
I know. Someone's going to get me on that.
Yeah, so that kind of, I have a couple questions, but I'm just going to stick to one. Kind of going along, like, your internalization of your identity of a mother of a trans person, do you ever worry that your identity as a mother of a trans person is maybe more, like, you're more concerned with the trans piece of Penelope's identity than he might be in the future, or maybe is now?
I hope.
Okay.
I hope it becomes irrelevant. I hope it is something. Was that the question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've thought about how to navigate that, or if you ever get concerned that, maybe he just wants to be a boy and he doesn't want to think about being a trans boy all the time.
And I hope that that the children, the youngins, right, Gen X and millennials, don't sit in rooms like this talking about gender year after year, generation after generation. I hope that as a cisgender person, I mean, it is silly for a cis person to start to talk about trans people and that trans experience, but there's nobody talking about it. So for adults, it's important. Anyone who has new insight on this, anyone who has an experience that's different from mainstream culture, has to talk about it. So I asked permission from Penelope. He's given me permission. I asked him if he doesn't mind, or if he likes, or if he hates it. He said he likes it a lot. I asked him if he wants to speak, and he said no. And I said, why? He said, it's boring. Like, none of my friends are interested in this. It's boring. And that is smart, because they are past it. They said, Penelope, why are you wearing a tie and why are you wearing pants? Because I'm a boy and I like ties and pants. Okay, cool, got it. Let's move on. They asked simple questions and they got back to the business of sharing time together. So I know that we are pontificating on an old topic. We are moving much slower than our kids. And I know that they probably find me, boring or silly, but as I look at laws, we adults still need to get this shit together. And as I look at the schools that my children go to, when they start to move away from me and I have to say, okay, I believe in this institution, or I trust this government, or this community will be safe even if I'm not there to protect my kids, the conversation isn't even halfway at the point. So I know that I care more than Penelope to say the word transgender. He doesn't, and at home he's not eating transgender spaghetti. We don't even talk, we rarely talk about this unless Cassius is debating it, but as soon as we leave the house, I need everyone to understand, and I will say it out loud, and I'll look at people in the eye, and I'll say my kid is transgender. And if they flinch, if they look weird, I'm not going to be, my kids aren't coming around you. You figure it out on your own time. And if I say my daughter's genderqueer, or if I say, oh, guess what, I just bought some Packers today, and I was explaining to my kids what Packers are. And all of these things are, you don't even know what I'm talking about, right? What is a pack? But these are the kinds of things that we need to talk about. And I liked when you said, ask a transgender person a question. Ask a mom of a transgender person a question. Ask me, because I want us to talk about it so much that we're bored of it. I know I'm redundant in this, but I hold so strong to the fact that if I didn't know what cisgender meant or transgender, and if many of us don't, then we are at a disservice to our children. And that means that the divide between old and young is deep, which means that our institutions won't retain our young people, our companies won't interest our young people, and where will we be, right? I want to be with my kids. I want to be with young people. I want to be with my grandchildren. I want to have a similar language. And so it takes me to talk to us this way, knowing that it is a little bit silly. But yeah, but it's a great question, and I am with you all the way. I don't mean to over-trans him, and I don't want to be over-black, right? I don't want people to over-black me. But I tell you, every time I walk into the room, I say, okay, is race going to supersede everything else? Am I going to be the only black person in the room? And they won't be able to understand what I'm talking about because they'll be looking at me as a black person. So I put that on the table first. Then we can get past that. And I have to put my cis privilege on the table first, and then I have to talk about my trans kid. Get all those things, like get into them. That's my take.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here and participating. 2 more plugs. Supporting underheard voices and stories is at the heart of everything that we do at KUOW in our community engagement department. And I just want to say that we're always asking ourselves, how do we do this work? How do we support telling and sharing the stories that we don't hear enough of, not just in the media, but in the world? And one way you can support that is buying the art that's telling those stories by the people who are from those communities. So I just want to say again that Elliott Bay is here today. Jodie's book is available for purchase. And Jodie, thanks for giving the plug for Ask a Transgender Person. I feel like I would love for everyone in this room to come back. Our event is next Saturday. We'll also feed you a really nice lunch. It really is a transformative, powerful experience to be a part of one of these ASCA events. And so we would love to have you all there and come and participate either as an asker or as an answerer. You can go to the website, ask.kuow.org, but I think we also have ASCA flyers available on our KUOW table. But thank you for our panelists, and Jeannie for moderating, Jodie and Spencer for being on our panel, and for all of you for being here tonight. Thank you so much.